Welcome to Supercool, the show about extraordinary solutions that cut carbon and improve modern life. Each week on Supercool, we go behind the headlines to pinpoint the stories and data accelerating the low-carbon economy in towns and cities across the U.S. and around the globe. I'm your host, Josh Dorfman. Imagine wherever you live, you're on city council or town council. You've run for office, campaigned with a platform and a vision, and been elected. Now, you want to get things done for your community. But like most cities, there's a frustrating reality: budget constraints. There's never enough money for everything you want to achieve, and it's a constant negotiation, filled with compromises, a balancing act. Then, someone new steps up at a city council meeting. It's the usual routine, mundane, procedural, until they say, "Have I got a deal for you?" Everyone perks up. They promise a solution that will make the city more money, claiming every dollar invested will return 3. Naturally, you ask, well, that sounds too good to be true. What's the catch? And they say, no catch, just trees. And then they explain. Data shows that neighborhoods with more trees have higher property values, which in turn increases property tax revenue. We've controlled for race, wealth, and other factors, and the results are clear. More trees, more value. More value, more revenue for the city. Now, you might not care for trees. Maybe you don't even like them. Maybe an acorn fell on your head once when you were about to propose to your partner and ruined the mood, and now you're just taking it out on all the other trees. Maybe your camp counselors made you go on forced marches, that some call hikes, in the forest when you just wanted to be playing basketball, and now you hold an ongoing grudge against nature. I don't know. But all of a sudden, you're hearing that planting trees in your city might unlock extra dollars for your priorities. That's appealing. And it also turns out that while global efforts to protect forests like the Amazon are critical for planetary health, the trees closest to you that are on your street, in your parks, and around your home are more critical to your well-being than many, if not all of us, truly comprehend. Today's guest, Jeff Donovan, is an urban forester, researcher, and economist at the U.S. Forest Service under the U.S. Department of Agriculture. His research focuses on quantifying the benefits of urban trees, and he shares findings that are emerging now in the 21st century of the critical role urban trees play in our quality of life. The findings are shifting how we think about trees, not just as climate warriors, but as essential to improving public health, reducing crime, boosting mental well-being, and even increasing voter turnout. The quantity, diversity, and maturity of trees in your immediate neighborhood impact everything from pregnancy outcomes to childhood immune diseases, depression, and life expectancy. So next time you're deciding where to live, whether for the schools, healthcare, or community amenities, it's time to start inquiring about the trees. And one quick note before we jump in. This is our 13th episode of the show. If you're new to Supercool or have been enjoying it since we launched over the summer, we'd love to hear from you with any feedback or recommendations of topics you'd like us to cover. You can shoot me a note at josh@getsuper.cool. It would also help us out if you would subscribe to the show and leave us a review wherever you're listening. We also have a weekly newsletter that accompanies the podcast and delves deeper into climate innovation as we track the new low-carbon economy. You can find it at getsuper.cool/newsletter. All right, on to the show. Here's Jeff.
So I'm coming at this from the science side of it. So I'm a research scientist. So you have some people who are the sort of practicing urban foresters who would involve in sort of the planting and maintenance of trees in an urban area. But for me, what I'm interested in is the benefits that they provide. So as a scientist, if you're interested in the benefits that trees provide, you realize it's all about the urban areas because it's about that intersection of people and trees. And the trees that people live next to day to day are the ones that really provide by far the greatest benefits. So if you're interested in the benefits that trees provide, being in a city is really the place to be.
Interesting. And so your research over a couple of decades is fascinating. And so you're welcome. So here's how I want to approach this today. There's so much to get into in terms of that intersection between trees and humans and the urban environment. And so I'm just going to lay this out. And so just for our audience too, they know where we're going. And this all kind of pulls from your research or other research that's certainly connected to yours. But we're going to talk about the relationship. So I was thinking about, well, how should we do this? And then I thought, I'm going to save the best for first. And so we're going to talk about the connection or the association between more trees, less death, or said another way, more trees nearby, you stand a better chance of staying alive, right? We're going to talk about more trees, less crime, or said another way, more trees, you can have a safer neighborhood. We'll talk about more trees, less depression, right? Studies that are showing that you live around trees, you and your neighbors are quite likely to be prescribed less antidepressants. And we'll get into the more trees, less overall disease and sickness and some of the fascinating benefits that trees provide. And then I want to make sure we touch upon the economic benefits in terms of more trees, less energy cost, and some of the cost benefit analysis of having trees. And I think that kind of gives us a way to approach the impact of trees, which goes really beyond, in some respects, are kind of, we don't think about these trees. In one way, I feel like when you're talking about trees and the conversation we're going to have, we're starting to have this conversation. And when you're listening, you say, oh yeah, okay, that makes sense. But we just don't think about trees delivering all of these benefits to humans. So why don't we start with that linkage? This comes out of your research, looking at this linkage between trees in the urban environment and what that means for mortality rates.
Yeah, that's the big one, isn't it? Public health and mortality. But one of the difficulties with all this line of research is that, where are the neighborhoods with more trees in a city? They're going to be in the areas that are whiter, wealthier, and better educated. And we absolutely know things like race, education, income impact health. One of the things is trying to untangle that relationship. And it can be tricky to do, and there are statistical techniques, but you can take advantage of what's called a natural experiment sometimes. And in this case, with tree planting, there's a non-profit in Portland called Friends of Trees. And since 1990, they planted about 50,000 street and yard trees. Now, what's interesting there is they had been focusing on underserved communities. While the existing tree canopy in a city is biased towards whiter, wealthier, better educated neighborhoods, this new tree canopy wasn't. And that's what it was an exciting prospect. So you've been putting in these trees for decades. What happens? If they are better for you, should you see an impact? And that's what we did. And we found that in neighborhoods that had more tree planting, we saw lower rates of non-accidental and cardiovascular mortality. And what was also interesting is as those trees aged and grew, we found that an association increased in both significance and size. So being around a 5-year-old tree had some benefits. By the time that tree gets to 15, 20 years old, you see even bigger benefits, which is what you'd expect, right? The ways in which trees improve health, there's a whole range of them. But let's just take one example, air pollution. So trees can absorb air pollution, and we absolutely know air pollution puts you at a risk for a whole range of diseases. Now that's really the capacity of a tree to absorb air pollution. More leaves, less air pollution. So you would expect then as trees age and grow, as they get more leaves, you would have a bigger impact on health. And that is what we found. So that was cool. Because these trees, these new plantings weren't in the nicer neighborhoods, that really allowed us to be a little more sure we're seeing an effect of the trees, not just of those other things, demographics.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. I was reading about this and working with Friends of Trees in Oregon, and that they had meticulous records going back for 3 decades, right, of planting 50,000 trees. So you could then go look at where those trees were planted, how old they are, and then pull in, I guess, census data based on 140 tracts, which roughly equals a neighborhood. And you could do this overlay and really see the impact. So but this is what I'm saying, Jeff. If someone says, yeah, trees, they take pollution out of the air, they're good for air pollution. Someone says, oh, okay, well, that's, yeah, all right, I buy that. But when you can then contextualize it, right, and say, no, if you are in a city, there's enough impact of statistical significance, right, that this matters. If you live in a neighborhood with more trees, and I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but it was something like 11.3 trees equals 15 fewer deaths, something like that, right?
Very roughly, what we found is planting 100 trees was associated with one fewer death.
100 trees, one fewer death. Okay.
Yeah, roughly speaking, as a broad brush. So you get 100 trees in the ground, you seem to avoid one death. So that's not a trivial number. You start to plant thousands of trees, this can really have an impact.
Yeah, and we've seen, when we talk to mayors and people from different cities or who are working on trees around the globe, like we've seen a city like Addis Ababa in Ethiopia where they're planting millions of trees and have figured out the mechanism to get it done. But that connection I find extraordinary, that you can actually show this from a health perspective, what it means based on mortality, which is something we just would never imagine. Like we would never draw that conclusion.
I think you really hit on the point here that people have a general sense, oh, trees are nice. I've often said trees are nice isn't a very useful statement from a policy perspective. But what I always thought is if trees are that nice, if they do have such a profound effect on our well-being, if that's the case, then along comes the soulless economist, me, and tries to find actual numbers. If they really are that great, then we should be able to see an impact. And that's what we did. And in fact, this study was a companion study to a study I did about 10 years ago. And in that case, we took advantage of a different natural experiment in the opposite direction. So in Portland, we're saying, if we plant trees, do we see good things happen? But what I did back in 2013 is we took advantage of the spread of an invasive tree pest, which is the emerald ash borer. So as that spreads and we lose trees, so the opposite happens, what do we see? And we saw increases in cardiovascular and lower respiratory mortality. So I think those two together are really powerful evidence. We see if you take trees away, we see increases in mortality. And if we add them back in, we see decreases in mortality. And so I think when you see evidence like that combined, I think it really does strengthen the evidence. Again, the trees aren't just they aren't just a nice thing that you add. They're like the icing on the cake or something. One of the things I say, and I mean this, and I choose the words carefully here, is that trees are an essential part of our public health infrastructure. And I mean they're an incredibly cost-effective part of our public health infrastructure. Treating people for diseases is very expensive. Human life is very valuable. Trees are not expensive. And so if, for example, in that study on tree planting, we did just a cost-benefit analysis, a very simple cost-benefit analysis. And we found that the benefit-cost ratio of planting trees, when you're looking at changes in mortality, was about 1,700 to 1. So for each dollar you spent on tree planting, we saw at least, and this is a lower bound estimate, at least $1,700 in health benefits. So
health benefit. Okay.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And that's based on the EPA data on how they now put cost of life or cost of a human life, $10+ million or so.
Precisely. Yeah.
Okay. So a couple of things that I want to key into there and to maybe pull on this thread. So the cost benefit analysis from a public health perspective, when you say this very precisely, good public health policy is planting trees, right? The return is extraordinary. You've also talked about research that shows that when trees go into a neighborhood, the property values rise, which then leads to more, property taxes for the city. And you've also, as an economist, drawn this connection that says more property taxes. If you look at how much the city is earning from higher property taxes and draw that connection back to trees, you could pay for planting those trees and more and have some budget surplus for the city, right? So the economics behind doing this just makes a ton of sense, whether you care about trees pulling carbon out of the atmosphere and climate change, whether you care about mortality and keeping your citizens alive.
Yeah.
Right? Well, this works in the self-interest of a city to do this.
Precisely. What we found in that case, so let's say you're a politician. I mean, presumably politicians one would hope they care about whether their constituents die or not. But let's say even if they don't, even if they're completely indifferent to their constituents' well-being, what we found is each dollar spent on trees, you got about $3 back in increased tax revenues. So they're self-financing in a way which, can you think of a government expenditure that's self-financing in that fashion? They just aren't. It doesn't mean that those expenditures aren't worthwhile. And sometimes there are indirect, let's say we spend money on schools, kids do better, ultimately they become more valuable members of society, a laudable goal indeed, but it's harder to draw a clear connection. In this case, it was just like, yep, trees go in the ground, prices go up, tax revenues go up, that's it. And that's, again, if you don't care about health, you don't care about climate change, you don't care about energy costs, you don't care about crime, you don't care about any of that. You simply care about your own property tax revenues. It's almost embarrassing. The types of benefits that trees provide, they're just flamboyantly large. You know, we used to get those email scams, like the Nigerian email scams, and they would offer these rates of return if we would just send somebody however many dollars. Even they would have been embarrassed to give these rates of return. So it's and I sometimes even wonder whether it actually, ironically, makes those numbers less credible because they're so large and people have a difficult time.
A lot of this research is still new, right? Even if the study's been around for a decade, that's still relatively new for it to really seep into culture and for people to really understand.
Yes.
Your point taken, right? There's the benefits maybe they seem too good to be true. And we're going to poke that a little, probably a lot more. I'm going to stay on trees and some of the services they provide or the functions they provide. And I guess we'll stay from a public health perspective, because just along those lines, the work you've done to show the linkage between tree canopy near where you're living, and of course you want a more diverse tree canopy, not a single species, right? But showing that as it relates to things like childhood leukemia, immune diseases, asthma. Can you talk about what it is about trees that you've found and researchers have found that starts to provide these types of positive healthcare benefits?
Yeah, and that's a really good point that you bring up about the diversity, and that's key. And a lot of some of the early sort of green health research, we treated trees or even the sort of broader natural environment as just widgets. You know, you add 10 trees, you get X benefits. But what it turns out that the relationship between trees and plants more broadly and health is really complex and has many different pathways. And one of them is that the trees and plants offer a habitat for microbes, bacteria living on their leaves. It's a vast habitat. So the area of the world's leaves, if you looked at the total area of the world's trees and plants leaves, that's twice the land area of the world. So it's just an enormous habitat. Okay, well, that's great, but aren't bacteria bad for us? Don't they make us sick? Well, it turns out sometimes yes, but sometimes they're crucial to our well-being. There's something you may be familiar about called the hygiene hypothesis.
No.
This notion, this came out in the late 80s, a Scottish researcher, I believe, and he found an interesting relationship that kids who had more older siblings were less likely to get asthma and hay fever. And I was like, why would that be? It turns out having those, and then this research found other things. Kids who go to daycare are less likely to get immune diseases. Well,
asthma and other immune diseases.
Yeah, exactly. When we talk about immune diseases or allergies, for example, it's just our immune system reacting inappropriately to a stimulus. So, you know, somebody who has some peanuts when they're allergic, their immune system goes crazy and they get a really anaphylactic reaction. It needn't be that extreme. So why is this? Why on earth would having exposure to dirt, like, I remember, you know, I have I rubbed my sister's face in the dirt a lot, the younger sister. It turns out I was helping her. I was helping her health. Not a word of thanks, mind you, not a word of thanks.
Jeez, so ungrateful, so ungrateful.
Let's not get into that. But so why could this be? Well, it turns out that we need exposure to microbes for our immune systems to develop properly. It stimulates our immune system. And without that, they just get flabby and the immune system doesn't work as well. And so in consequence, when stimuli come along, they react inappropriately and you get immune diseases. So what the study or two there, one on asthma and one on childhood leukemia, they're both immune diseases. They're both diseases of the immune system. And what we looked at very simply is, hey, if kids who live in more diverse areas, more biodiversity around them in their immediate neighborhood, does it have an impact on their likelihood of developing those diseases? And we found in both cases, yes. The asthma one was interesting. We found that living in a greener neighborhood was good. So you just got a benefit there. But in addition, and it's clear this is on top of that, if that greenness was more diverse, that was even better. So green is good, more diverse green is even better. And in the case of childhood leukemia, which is just an appalling disease, it's the most common pediatric cancer on the world. Unfortunately, it's on the rise, particularly in developed countries. And what we found is that kids who live in more biodiverse areas are less likely to develop childhood leukemia. So it's not just the trees and plants themselves, but it's the habitat. It's the microbes that live on those leaves can also benefit our health. So it's really a very rich network here.
Wow. Let's say I'm living in Brooklyn. I'm living in Park Slope.
Yeah.
Maybe I live on a leafy street. If those trees are diverse in their plantings, that's obviously better. And when you think about that, as a parent, in terms of asthma, which can be so debilitating for children, and of course childhood leukemia, which is one of the just so it's beyond words how awful that can be for families, for the child, for everyone involved. And so I live in New York City. I'm about to get married. I'm going to have a kid, and now I'm going to move maybe somewhere like into the suburbs. Okay, that could be, maybe that's a good move. But if you're going to stay in the city, wherever you're going to go, you want to be thinking, okay, I'm going to look on Zillow for house prices, but maybe I need to start thinking about what is the habitat, what's the tree canopy, what is the plant diversity to give my kids the best shots at a healthy, happy childhood. That is like a total paradigm shift for most urbanites, and certainly probably for most people.
Yeah, well, think of the classic shift there is, remember when we didn't want to give kids peanut butter?
Okay.
That was a terrible thing. We do that and we they're going to get this terrible response. Turns out that was exactly the opposite of what you should be doing. You look, for example, in Japan, there's hardly any peanut allergies because they're exposed to peanut oil as a kid. So small exposures as a kid help your immune system develop that way, so that when you do get exposed to peanut butter sandwich, you don't get this anaphylactic response. So it turns out we were giving people the wrong response. In the same way, hygiene is important. How we treat sewage and things like that. That's really important from a public health perspective, but it can go too far. So it's good to be exposed to dirt, to trees and plants, to other kids in daycare and stuff. It turns out we really need that for our immune systems to develop properly. And again, we want to keep our kids wrapped in a bubble. Turns out that really isn't the way to go.
Yeah. And one of the things that I've heard you say was, something to the effect of, you can't prescribe another sibling, right?
No.
But you could plant more diverse trees in a neighborhood, and over time increase the probability of good outcomes, decrease the probability of poor outcomes, right? This is not a panacea. There's no guarantee of anything, but the studies show that there is this association between neighborhoods that have more trees. You start to see these outcomes that everyone would hope for. And again, this kind of goes back to the point of the outcomes might seem too good to be true, but this research is still so new.
It is.
That, and it does seem so like miraculous. Yes, that is, yes. It does. That I can see why it might just be hard to pierce people's innate adult cynicism or skepticism of like, really? Can it really be? But clearly the data and research is there.
Yeah, absolutely. The newness is an interesting one, and just the uniqueness of these results. But I think sometimes this is where you have to combine the science, and as science communicators, which I at least attempt to be, is that we think of other things here too. So sometimes when I'm talking to people, giving a presentation, I'll ask them to imagine, most people as a kid, if you ask them, do you have a memory of losing a big tree in your neighborhood? Ask people to close their eyes and think about that. And most do. I have a memory of losing a sycamore tree in my neighbors, and it was like there was a hole in the sky. It was really it was a kind of profound impact. And try to get people to have that emotional connection too. And I've used poems. I read out poems sometimes. Seamus Heaney, the Irish poet, has a beautiful poem where he uses the loss of a chestnut tree as a child as a metaphor for the death of his mother. And I think when you hear stuff like that, it can help people. Let's be clear, I'm not saying abandon science and take up poetry, but understand that these numbers can seem a little difficult to connect with. So if you understand that as scientists, we're very new to this, but artists, poets, theologians, they've all understood that trees are potent metaphors for health and well-being. This is not news to them.
Yeah.
So I think that can sometimes be a way of helping people to connect.
That makes sense to me. I think also there's that childhood affinity for sure for trees. It's still very potent and powerful in me. We're always looking to live in neighborhoods. We just feel more comfortable. We feel calm, we just feel better, right? Just psychologically on some level, I'm sure connected to the things we're talking about. One of the things that must be very exciting, I'm interested to hear your thoughts, but the Inflation Reduction Act provides for $1.5 billion for tree planting and then maintenance of those trees, right, over time for your organization, right, the USDA, the U.S. Forest Service, to distribute. And 1.2 billion has gone out to something like, maybe more now, but something like 1.2 billion to roughly 400 cities, communities, different organizations now to do this type of work. I was reading an article about that, and there was an arborist in one of the cities who was talking about how they plan to plant a diversity of trees, a range of trees. She was talking about it from the point of view of survival of the trees in relation to potentially disease. Will they take? Are they native? Can they survive in an urban environment, which is tricky because you have to put it potentially in a sidewalk. It's tricky. But she was talking about diversity in terms of survival of the trees. You're talking about diversity in terms of survival of the humans.
And she's absolutely right. We love to see, let's say, being in a street where you have mature American elm down both sides of the street, where the canopy meets overhead in the middle. There's something aesthetically and in the sort of landscape architecture literature, we're drawn to that, to symmetry. And it is beautiful. It's absolutely stunning. Or I was just in Europe and lines of plane trees, just, on both sides of the street. And it's gorgeous, but it's susceptible to disease. Obviously, the elm were lost. A lot of those elm were lost. We have the emerald ash borer. So yes, diversity helps people, but it also makes the canopy itself more resilient, so that you maybe lose 20% of the canopy rather than 100%. And I think those sudden shocks in canopy can be particularly bad for people. There's also something you brought up, which I think is crucial. When we think of trees, we think of planting new trees. It's profoundly important. But what my research and other people's has shown is that size matters. And it's those big mature trees that matter. So maintaining those trees, keeping them around, is at least as important as planting new ones. Obviously, if you start planting trees, you don't have mature trees. But keeping those mature trees around is so important. And I've been trying to work out exactly how to get at this, but do some work on the health benefits of those really large trees, the ones that bind a neighborhood together. And there is some indication that size matters, but I wonder if disproportionately size matters. If a tree is double the size, my guess it more than doubles the health benefits, for example.
It would be really interesting to understand in an urban environment whether there are connections and networks between trees like you do find in a mature forest, where the big trees are connected to all the other trees, and there are all the benefits, the co-benefits, and the sharing of resources that happens within that network. It'd be really interesting to understand. But one of the cities that we took a look at recently in China, Hangzhou, has they have this categorization. They have like almost 30,000 trees. It's very meticulous. I mean, like 29,700 something or other trees in their urban environment. 1,600 some odd of those trees, I think, were categorized as ancient. And
Right.
then something like 500 of those were like very, very ancient, like over 500 years old. And I wonder, it would be interesting to take a look at a city like that and do that, to have that type of understanding, right? Especially in the US, where we've lost so much of our old growth. And I don't know if there are cities that still have old growth, or if there's, I guess my question to you is, are there cities you would go take a look at? Is it Portland? Is it somewhere else that you could do that type of research?
Well, there are, for the Southeast, for example, some of those big live oaks.
Oh, for
They're
sure.
amazing. Yeah, so they're huge.
That's where we are. We're just a couple hours up the coast from Charleston, and some of the trees here are just. That's why we love it,
Absolutely.
right? We love trees.
When
I mean, it's awesome. Yeah.
I come from the Pacific Northwest, and that's where I live now, and you think of them as, we've got all these huge trees, but when I see those live oaks, they are majestic. Unfortunately, one of the probably best ways scientifically to study these trees is when they disappear, because then you get this sudden shock. If you lose these large trees, what happens to health? So I've been doing some work, hasn't published yet, but where we look at tree removal permits and see whether they have an impact on health. And these removal permits show the size of the tree. So when you lose those trees that are 4 or 5 feet in diameter, what does that mean for a neighborhood? Nothing good, I suspect. And I think it's not just health. I think the neighborhood cohesion, the social connectivity, which also feeds back into health. I had a study a couple of years ago where I was trying to measure those social connections. A lot of the studies that use social connections use self-reported surveys and stuff. So I was like, can I come up with a real objective metric? And it turns out that one of the things that happens when we have more social connections in a neighborhood, we tend to vote more. It's a fairly good metric. And what I found was, when you plant more trees in a neighborhood, that voter turnout goes up. I know it sounds weird, but again, I think social connections are underappreciated. Well, maybe not after COVID. I think COVID taught us that social connections are so profound for our well-being. We know, like, loneliness kills you. And so asking a question to what type of neighborhoods allow us to forge those social connections. And I think trees and the natural environment parts can help with that. I suspect they also help people stay longer. They forge those connections. I live in a neighborhood now. I haven't lived in a house this long in my adult life, 15 years. And you start to make those connections with neighbors, and you start to understand the neighborhood and that connection to both the built and natural part of it. And I think that's an area which I'm really trying to take advantage of.
I love that. And one of the themes that has emerged as we've been doing the podcast, talking to experts across the gamut of different professions and industries, is you start to get this sense, and I said this to Aaron, our producer and my co-founder, that these strategies that get deployed on city streets, so let's say planting more trees, we're talking about all the benefits, the amazing benefits of doing that from a public health perspective. They also have the impact of more people are outside, more people are engaged. It's what you're talking about, the social cohesion. And then you draw this link and you say, hey, maybe that turns out more people vote, and the trees may have, are playing a role in that. But that you look at these strategies, and then we look at bike lanes, and we look at other things that come in. What the overall sense that Aaron and I start to get is that when cities start to do things that kind of calm things down, like, you could look at a kind of the correlation or the causal going any direction, but like the strategies that decrease stress also decrease carbon. Plant more trees, slow down traffic, walkable cities, right? All these things that like calm a city, make it more livable, are also taking down carbon. You can look at it the other way and say, hey, how are we going to take down carbon? Let's go do bike lanes. Let's go plant more trees. Let's go do all this XYZ. And then the benefit of solving climate change in that way is like, you're going to get a more livable, less stressed city.
There's complex bidirectional effects there. But yeah, I completely agree. And sometimes I think those co-benefits end up swamping the original reason you did something. Which is fine. Which is fine.
Yeah, exactly. I want to make sure I do ask you before we part ways, you did some of the kind of original, very important research on this connection between trees and crime. And of course, that goes also to this conversation I think we're having about social cohesion, probably a lot of other things that tie into this linkage. But you did studies, there were studies done in Baltimore, in New Haven, you're in Portland, there's related work in Philadelphia, Chicago. that do show this association between where trees are in a neighborhood, right, controlling for other variables, you see a reduction in crime. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, it's a fascinating one. Are you familiar with the broken windows hypothesis in criminology?
I can imagine what that is. If there's a broken window, you're going to get more. If an area looks like it's not being taken care of, you'll get more crime, that type of thing.
Precisely. It was a big thing in the 80s with Giuliani, and Bratton, I think, was the police commissioner there. And it was somewhat controversial, but the general findings are that if you have signs of social disorder, so broken windows, graffiti, garbage and things, it sends a subliminal signal to somebody that a neighborhood isn't well cared for, that if they were to commit a crime, less likely to be caught and reported. So I think trees are the opposite of a broken window, particularly large mature trees, that they send that signal that a neighborhood there are social connections, that somebody may call the police or somebody may intervene. And so I think that's how trees may decrease crime. You have to be a little careful with trees, with view obstruction, because view obstruction is a huge deal in crime. You don't want to offer cover for criminals or obstruct views. So things like, for example, you might think that putting, say, a 6-foot-high wooden fence around your house would help reduce crime. It tends to do the opposite, because it obstructs views. If somebody's over that fence, they can break into your house and so forth. So the only thing you'll be careful there is when you plant trees, make sure they're not blocking windows, blocking sight lines. But that generally can be dealt with. But yeah, I think that subliminal signal that a neighborhood is well cared for. And a well cared for neighborhood where you have social connections between people is going to have less crime.
When I was preparing to talk with you, Jeff, and even months ago, I came across this research, and I was talking to my youngest daughter, my 9-year-old, and then I told her, okay, I'm going to get to talk to Jeff, and we're going to talk about crime. And I was telling her about it. I'm like, it's counterintuitive because a lot of people think more trees, sort of conventional, stereotypical thinking is more trees in a city neighborhood, more crime for this.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
But she's like, Dad, no, that's not true. Yeah, maybe like the criminals can hide, but the people can hide too. You could hide behind a tree.
Go.
I could hide behind a tree. And I was like, well, you can never argue with a 9-year-old and expect to win, right? I mean, the logic is always, it's always very compelling.
It'd be a fool's errand arguing with a 9-year-old.
It'd be a fool's errand. You've seen the research also around trees in the cities, trees in your neighborhood, and depression, anxiety. Yeah. I mean, there was one study that did come out talking about fewer antidepressants prescribed. Right, in a neighborhood when there's trees. And so that's, again, contextualized in a way where it's not just generalized anxiety that goes away or you feel calmer, but it was this sort of like specific clinical statement that a lot of people will be like, oh, where is that neighborhood? Because I'm depressed all the time. I'm like, where do I go?
And I think also to go back to something you said is really important here, to show that it's really an issue of decreasing the probability. Nobody's suggesting you can entirely cure depression, or maybe you can. Probably not, though. I think stress is enormously important. I think urban environments, modern lifestyles, we're just used to this chronic low-level stress, or sometimes not even low-level, and the effect that has on us, and that we can't recover from that effectively. And so this is, I think, where trees can help. I think this was the social psychologist, Rachel and Stephen Kaplan, I believe, and they made a distinction between soft and hard fascination. So, for example, if you were to drive and you have to pay attention to what's out the window, doing that will eventually decrease your cognitive capacity. You can only do it for so long. It would degrade your capacity to concentrate eventually. The natural environment is the opposite. You have a soft fascination. The way in which you engage with it is restorative. And this isn't me speculating. There's been research to show that. So I think that fundamental difference between the built and natural world, one will degrade your capacity to concentrate, and one will restore it. Is it then surprising that would have an effect on mental health? Hardly, because stress is so fundamental a thing to a whole range. I mean, anxiety and depression, obviously stress is a fundamental part of that. And it goes back again to that issue I talked about. If trees are good for us, then we should be able to see these associations. It would be surprising if you didn't see an impact on the prescription of mental health medications. So There was one of those studies in Canada, I think. I remember seeing that a few years ago. It's good to see, not surprising.
Jeff, I just want to thank you for taking the time to come on Supercool today. I feel like everything we've talked about to me is totally super cool.
Thank you.
I'm fascinated by your research
Thank you.
and excited about it, and just to have a chance to talk with you and hear the insight into trees and the intersection between humans and trees, and why that's so important in cities. I really appreciate the work you do.
Thank you. It's always nice to get that feedback, and I appreciate the invitation.